Hi, my name is Joel Tax. I'm with Reserve Data Analysis. I'm just going to go over one of our sample studies here today. If you're watching this, you probably have a copy of one of our studies we did for you, and this video will be quite helpful in explaining some of the numbers and some of the concepts, and I'll have some links and whatnot that will pop up as we go through the study. The easiest way to do this is for you to print out your table of contents and your component index pages. That's the component index pages at the end of the report, and the table of contents should be page 2 of the report. And that way you can open up the study in a PDF format on your computer, and you can jump around to different sections if you like, utilizing the table of contents and the index page that are actually printed out, and you don't have to do a lot of flipping back and forth. We found that to be pretty helpful for most people and navigating through the report. So let's get started here. So the first page of the report is obviously just the cover page. Pretty straightforward here. One item you want to look at is what version of the report you have in front of you. Could be a draft report, could be a final, could be any number of other names, sometimes called client revised final or draft 2, something like that. Below that, just the date that the report was completed, and obviously our contact information and whatnot. Table of contents starts on page 2, sometimes rolls over to page 3. This is very helpful to navigate to different sections within the reserve study. Again, the easiest way to do this is to print this page off on an actual piece of paper, as well as the component index pages. And so you usually have about 3 pages that you can refer to go to specific page numbers, to find things like the recommended funding summary, or the recommended funding projections, or the annual expenditure report, as well as a summary page here. It's going to have a summarized the whole report. So the table of contents is very helpful, and it makes it easier to navigate through the reserve study, which can be quite lengthy. This sample one isn't even that long of a one. It's 102 pages, it looks like here. So next is just the introduction page. Again, pretty straightforward, just summarizes some of the information. And on your reserve study, this will probably be slightly different. These are kind of catered to each client, and I constantly am updating this page of the study to make it a little easier for a reader to understand what's going on and what we're trying to accomplish. Next is our summary page. On this page, you're going to find information, the profile of the community, just pretty basic, the name, number of units. Base year could be the year it was constructed, or a year that the building received significant remodels. Fiscal year, and that's just when the fiscal year for this organization comes to a close. Oftentimes it's December 31st, but it could be any other number of dates depending on when the corporation was first incorporated. Parameters within the studies, these are just the items that we have placed in the study to come to our conclusions or recommendations. First, just levels of the study. It could be a level 1, which is a full reserve study with site inspection. A level 2 would be an update to the level 1, but with a site inspection as well. Or it could be a level 3, where it's just a in-office update to the cost and inflation figures and projects. There would be no site inspections on those years. The year it was prepared for, important just because it impacts the mathematical models, and the board will be making decisions for whatever fiscal year this reserve study is completed for. Last on-site inspection date, that's just when we were last on-site to do an actual site inspection. Allocation, increase rate, and the contingency rate. These are going to be slightly different for each funding model, and those can be found later in the reserve study. We'll go over that in a few minutes. Inflation rate, this is just typically right about 3%. Historically, that's what's always been right around there. It's going to fluctuate up and down in any given period of time, but for the long haul, it's averaged right about 3% interest rate. Below that, we have set at 1%. Again, 2017 here, it's well below 1%, but at some point in time, it will likely go higher than 1% as things kind of fluctuate back and average out over time. Tax rate, again, refer to the funding models later in the study. This will vary depending on how a community or organization files their taxes. It could be a nonprofit, which would be 0%, or it could be an HOA or condo, which often is 15 or 30%. The funding plan method below that, we typically would utilize a cash flow method, which is just a method which is not too conservative or too aggressive, and usually fits the goals of most communities. Below that is our summaries for the report, and within this section, we're going to just start right off the get-go here at the current reserve allocation. This is given to us by the client, and this is the amount that they're currently putting into their reserve account, specifically for reserves. So it's not an amount set into the operating account or into some other account. It's actually an amount set aside for reserves in a particular year. And below that, estimated fiscal year start balance. This is the amount that's actually in the reserve account set aside for reserves at the beginning of the fiscal year. Fully funded balance below this. This is an ideal amount that would be in the reserve account based on the component list and based on the projects that would be coming due and how much they've deteriorated at this point in time. And this fully funded balance will fluctuate up and down depending on what projects have come due and what have been done. To calculate the number below that of percent funded, what we do is take the current amount in the reserve account, we divide it into the fully funded balance, and that tells us approximately where a community is on this percent funded scale, with a 0 to 30% being a low percent funded. So those communities or organizations will have a high risk of running into a deficit in their reserve account and have to rely on things like loans or special assessments or some kind of other method of raising funds. 31 to 70% is a fair funded level. Communities and organizations in this range typically will kind of be on track towards a good funding range, but they still carry significant risk of going into a deficit in the reserve account, specifically when components are, when they fail earlier than what is projected, even a year or two early, could put the community into a deficit and a position where they have to rely on loans or special assessments. And then we have a high funded range, 70 to 100% funded. This is an area where most communities and organizations rarely have to rely on special assessments. It's also, unfortunately, somewhat rare for communities and organizations to be within this funded range. Usually it takes quite a few years to build up to that and stay within that. There's a lot of due diligence and a lot of effort that people will have to put into it over many years, and usually with varying boards over the years to reach that level. But it's also the level when we rarely see special assessments or loans being relied upon. Below that is a deficit or surplus per unit. So in this case, this community is 19% funded. Their reserve account balance is well below what the ideal amount is of $540,000. They only have $101,000, and that's essentially a deficit of $27,493 per unit. Again, up here, it's based on 16 units in this community. So in your particular community, when you read through this, you can estimate, well, how much somebody's going to have to make up for that difference there between the start balance and the fully funded balance. At some point in time, somebody will have to make up that difference in the future, and it's kind of broken down per unit for you there. Below that is our recommended baseline and current funding models. Here as well, We have recommended, baseline, current. You can also have another one below here that is an open space, and oftentimes this would be like a special assessment model, or FHA approval model, or some other expedited 100% funded model. Whatever the client is requesting, we can add in some additional funding models. The recommended, in this case, it's achieve 100% funded in 30 years, and it breaks it down per year, per month, and an average per unit a month. So that's people understand how much they're going to have to pay out of their pocket. Now this average per unit a month, with most communities there will be an additional page following this one, which goes into a breakdown of actually per unit based on what they own in the community. You have different sizes of units and different percentage ownership. So it's all based on how much they own and they need to put into the reserve account from the total. Underneath that, the baseline funding model. This only has a goal of keeping a reserve account above $0 for the entire 30 years. So oftentimes it will fluctuate up and down and dip right about zero. It's a much more risky model because of that. And we'll go into that a little bit later. But again, that's broken down per year, per month, average unit a month. And the current funding model, whatever we are supplied with, what the current allocation rate is, and that's broken down per year, per month, and average unit per month as well. So that's about it on the summary page. The next page, unit assessment distribution. Again, you want to make sure that we see this is based on the recommended funding model, not the current funded model or some other model, unless it states so up here. Typically, it would be the recommended funding model. This can be broken down in a variety of ways. In this case, it's just the unit name, A1, the percentage ownership, and then their monthly allocation from this total recommended amount. It could also be a square footage amount that's inputted here instead of a percent ownership. Every community is a little different, so it's based on what information we're provided, and how it's broken down to us is how we're going to report it on this page. This is very helpful for people to see exactly how much their specific special assessment or how much their specific reserve allocation rate would be. Now this number over on this side is not the total HOA's dues. This is just the amount being allocated to the reserve account from the HOA dues that you're contributing to your HOA. The next page is just going to be reserve analyst comments. On this page, we'll make comments regarding special assessments or loans or anything else that we see in the community that might be of interest, as well as any particular parameters that we were provided by the client. Say, oftentimes we're provided a threshold amount to not include anything below, say, $2,500, and because it's being paid from the operating account, something like that. Oftentimes we'll include those comments in this section, as well as a description of, say, different phases and whatnot in your community. If there's anything that may need further discussion, we oftentimes put it on this page, the Reserve Analyst comment page. Next, we'll often include building labels or a site map, just so a reader has an understanding of how we broke down different things in the community. Oftentimes we'll label them, as we have in this example, A building, B building, C building. The G's down there, those are all garages. So garage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Other communities will have specific addresses for buildings or specific names. It's based on, we try to make it as easy to read and relate to for people in the community, so when they read it they understand what building we're talking about. And oftentimes we're provided with maps that already have these labels, so we'll just try to copy those from the current maps of the community and put them into the reserve study. Next is what components are to be included in the reserve study, and this just goes into National Reserve Study Standards. It lists here just the 4 basic principles that we apply each component to, as well as reasons why components may be excluded from the reserve study. This is a good read and answers a lot of questions of what components we're going to be included and not, and why. National Reserve Study Standards, they're standards set up that hopefully have guided different reserve study professionals all in the same direction. So when I do a reserve study or another company does a reserve study, we have similar definitions, and we have similar reasonings for including or excluding components. So you're not going to get dramatically different studies if everything else is being equal. The component list should be very, very similar between the two, if the reserve study was done within a time period close to one another as well. With time, reserve studies do change. The next section of the reserve study is the component list. This is really essentially the most important part of the reserve study. All of our recommendations and all the funding models and mathematical equations are based on this component list. We want to make sure it's thorough and it's accurate, and the measurements are accurate. The place and service states are as close to as accurate as possible. And so you can go through this, and typically it's broken down by some kind of category. In this case, we have buildings, garages, and grounds. Other times it could be recreation centers, as well as any infinite number of other names and categories, depending on what you have on site. Within this component list, you have, I'll just go right up across the top here, we have the name of the component, the date and service, so the time it was constructed or significantly remodeled, the next replacement year on record. In this case, this component is to be replaced this year. The useful life, so in this case it's deck railings, metal paint. That means a useful life of every 5 years. We're recommending these deck railings be painted. Adjustment, this could be anything from a client request to defer some project for budgeting purposes, or if we go out to a community and a component appears to be deteriorating faster, we can make a negative adjustment to the useful life, or if it's lasting longer, we can do a positive adjustment. So it's going to last more than 5 years, we can push it out a couple years, say to 7 years, or something like that. Every component is different, and there'll be comments about why an adjustment was made later on in the component index section, and we'll go into that in a little bit later. But the adjustment figure will show up on this page, and you can see if something's been pushed out or is anticipated to come up sooner than what was originally anticipated or than is typical. Oftentimes we'll go out to a community and a 20-year roof for some reason lasts 15 years, and it could be a bad install, could be some kind of windstorm that happened at some point in time that caused some damage to the roof that wasn't caught. Whatever the case is, we can make adjustments for that and say, well, the roof typically has a useful life of 20 years, but we make an adjustment in this one, say we would do in this case -5 if the roof is failing at 15 instead of the typical 20 years. Oftentimes we don't know exactly why it's failing. Oftentimes it is an install issue, and that's all underneath materials. Typically we can't see why something was failing when we just observe it. You'll usually have to rip materials off, and then you can see underneath perhaps somebody used the wrong type of materials or nails or glue or whatever the case is, depending on what materials you're using. And then the remaining useful life. In this case, these deck railings, they're being replaced in 2017, so they have a remaining useful life of 0. But as you can see through the other components, this one right below it, the metal railings themselves being replaced, they have a useful life of 40 years, and they have 6 years left on their useful life before we're recommending them to be replaced. Next over is just the units utilized. In this case, it's 206 linear feet. These could be linear feet, it could be square footage, it could be each. So here's a good one, lights, exteriors, 35. And it says each, that means there's 35 fixtures on the building. Down here, squares. This is often questioned. This is not a typo, so roofing is typically sold in squares, not square footage, and 1 square equals 100 square feet. And we try to report it for each component based on how you're going to receive it in a bid from a vendor. So most roofers will utilize squares in their bids. So when you look at a bid that you receive from a roofer, it should be pretty close to what you see in your reserve study as far as measurements wise. We try not to switch it up so you can easily see that there's a difference there or not a difference based on the same measurement. So squares instead of, say, square footage. Next one over, just the unit cost. In this case, we have $2.25 or linear foot for deck metal deck railings to be painted in this scenario. And it could be any variety of different numbers based on our research and historical records of the community, whatever the case is. We try to have our cost be right in the middle of, say, if you got 4 or 5 bids, we try to be right in the middle somewhere. Bids will often range 15–20%. So you're going to see quite a fluctuation there, or difference there based on quality workmanship oftentimes, how busy the vendor is. You know, if it's a big project or a small project, you know, they'll give you different numbers if they really want the work or if they really don't want the work. And so what we try to do is try to be right in the middle of all those numbers based on our research and our experiences looking at many, many properties. And we also utilize cost indexes, and again, most accurately, historical records from the community or the organization. And then lastly, it's just the current cost, so the total of the unit costs multiplied by the units. In this case, $463 to paint these metal railings, deck railings. And you can go down and see all of the components here and our estimates and the total cost. And this is a current cost, not a future cost. Here is just the total for each group. In this case, this is buildings. Total cost for the components, current cost for those components within that section of the buildings is $349,000. And that's broken down per each section. You see garages, grounds. This goes on to the next page. We'll just go there. Actually, a couple pages here. Let's see here. So at the end of all the different categories that's broken down to, you have this total asset summary. That's the total cost to replace just the components on this list. That's the total current cost to replace these components on the list. This is not a cost to rebuild the buildings or anything else that's not on the list. It could be, there's many items that could come up, drainage issues, could be electrical or plumbing or whatever the case is in your community, which is not being funded for in the reserve study because we just don't have any estimate for a useful life or remaining useful life. Again, you can refer back to that earlier page of what components are included and excluded, and I'll give a good overview of why we would include things and not include things. So this number here is important to understand. It's not the total cost to, say, rebuild the buildings. This is only to replace the components if you were to do them all right now, all at once, which is obviously not going to happen, but it gives you a number of how much liabilities the organization or the community actually has. Next, we have the excluded components. This will sometimes be in the reserve study, sometimes will not, depending on if there's any items that need specific comments on. Oftentimes, we go to a community and have some large rock retaining walls, or in this case, storm sewer system, or it could be a retention pond, detention pond, things like that, where we really have no estimate for replacement on those items. They're very long life items and typically don't need total replacement within a time frame of the life of a typical building. Say 60 years is pretty typical. So we like to make some comments of why you don't see them in the component list, even though you walk around on site and you may see retaining walls all over the place. Below that, in this particular community, we have not association responsibility components. In this case, unit windows, unit doors, air conditioning units, heat pump equipment. It could be any variety, a number of components for your particular community. And this page, this excluded component page, will list those if there's a specific reason and specific list that we provided, or based on governing documents or interpretation of your governing documents. Whatever the case is, every community and organization is different on why they want to exclude certain items. But if there's any specific notes about any components, we want to put it up front here of why it was excluded. Next, we have our current cost by category chart, and this is just an illustration of a visual, essentially, of how much the different components cost on a percentage basis, their current cost. In this case, we can see roofing takes up the bulk of the cost in this particular community in the blue, followed by paint very closely, and followed by plumbing in this particular community. They had some plumbing issues. So this is this kind of a visual breakdown of those, and it gives you an idea of what items you probably most need to focus on. Say if you have large expenses related to the roof, you definitely want to make sure that you're budgeting appropriately for the roof, compared to, say, in this particular community, they have minimum amount of fencing. It'd be less, if you're going to choose one or the other, well, even if you don't, in this case, a fence and a roof, you want to make sure you budget for replacement, repair, maintenance of your roof way before your fence. But it could be any other number of components. Typically, most communities, it will give them, kind of put it on their radar while we have very large expenses related to whatever this item is. And sometimes this has some surprising figures on it. It could be underground sprinklers or drainage issues, whatever the case is, where people are not aware of some of these costs. And this is just kind of a visual to show you how much it really is going to cost to replace those items. The next page goes into the question of how much should a organization or community reserve. So really when we get asked this question, there's really no right or wrong answer. And you can read through this, and it goes into a bit about the different funding models and their different goals. But essentially, any client that comes to us and asks for a reserve state, we'll give our recommendations. And it's really up to them and their risk tolerance and their risk levels on how much they want to fund, and do they want to reach a 100% funded level, or do they always want to just be in a low percent funded range where there's a higher risk for reliance on things like special assessments and loans and whatnot. So it's not really an appropriate question for us to say, well, your community needs to set aside this amount. It's kind of like if you were to ask somebody, how much should I save for retirement? Do I want to retire and be a millionaire, or do I want to retire and just have a little apartment and not have a large bank account? I mean, I can still survive on both. Obviously, there's a much bigger risk if I don't have a cushion of savings when I retire. So it's kind of like that somewhat, and it's a question that can be difficult to determine for us, because every community and every board is different, and their risk tolerances are dramatically different. Some communities will care less about being a high percent funded, and they just want to stay in around a 50% funded range their entire the entire length of the study, and that's completely up to them. We also like to let them know that just means there's a higher risk for special assessments or loans at any given time should some of the components fail. So essentially, it's the higher your percent funded, the larger the margin of error is, and components essentially are able to fail earlier and you'll still have enough money to pay for the projects, as opposed to, say, a low funded model where you never get to a high percent funded figure, and then all of a sudden some the components fail earlier than projected, and then you're out of money. So it's just a higher risk scenario to be low percent funded, which is essentially just tied to how much is in the reserve account. And so there's really no right or wrong answer, but anything that, over the long haul, anything that results in a deficit to the reserve account would definitely not be a funding model we would recommend following, just because you're essentially saying we're not going to budget appropriately, and we know we're going to run out of money. And that's one of the kind of the basics for what we do, is we try to make fiscally responsible funding plans. So everybody understands how much the costs are and how much they really should be putting aside, at least to stay cash positive. That's a bare minimum. That would be the baseline funding plan, would be a bare minimum approach. And anything above that is just, it gets better and better as you get towards the full funding plan. Next is just a page about percent funded, goes into an explanation of low percent funded versus high percent funded and the risk associated with each. And that's a good read to go more into that. I'll also put a link in this video to some more information about percent funded and fully funded balance. Those should be popping up in the video screen at some point in time. The percent funded chart is just a visual of where the percent funded figures are projected to go with the different funding models. Recommended is typically towards a 100% funded model. In this particular case, dark red is the baseline funding model, where you can see it bounces off to 0% funded a couple of times within that 30-year period. And then the current funding projections. In this case, this community is in a very, very poor financial position, unfortunately. And even though you can't have a negative percent funded, technically that would be like having negative cash balance. We like to show it in the charts just so it shows the deficit that the client will have to face in their reserve account. And the next graph, the reserve account balance chart, also goes into that, where you'll see the recommended, in this case light blue. It fluctuates up and down as projects come due and are paid for, but overall increases significantly. Baseline also will increase, but there'll be years, these two particular years here, when it dips down to almost zero, and those are high risk years, specifically if components fail earlier than projected. So if you have some large expenses that fail a little bit, maybe a year or two early, and they happen to fall in one of these years when you already don't have any money in the reserve account, that's a huge issue. And that's why the baseline funding model is a much, much riskier model to follow. In this case, this current funding model, it goes into a negative deficit of almost $2 million by the end of the 30 years. Again, you can't realistically have a negative $2 million balance in the bank account, but we like to show it to show the amount in deficit that the community will be in. If we just had a straight line across where it just stops at zero, people really wouldn't know, essentially, visually at least, how much in deficit the account would be and how much they're going to have to make up. It's just a good visual. So next is the summary page for the recommended funding model. Again, you want to read just at the top here what funding model we're talking about. This will be the heading at the top of each of these funding models. It'll explain what it is, recommended or baseline or current, whatever the case is. And it goes into some of the basics here, the inflation rate, how much we are assuming the allocation to the reserve account increases annually, in this case 3%. Usually it will be an amount equal to the inflation rate. However, some communities, if they're really poorly funded, maybe they want a funding model in there that has a 5% increase annually instead of 3%, so they can make up some of that difference or get to a higher percent funded range. Below that, just your interest, Like I said earlier, we have 1%. In this case, this particular community has a 30% interest, or excuse me, a tax rate on their interest. So it has a net of 0.7%. And it breaks it down below here, just per unit and whatnot. And some comments about the recommended funding model, as well as the basic principles that we follow when we set up these funding models in our reserve studies. Next, we'll see the recommended funding projections. Again, you want to make sure you read the top of this page for the heading to see what funding model that you're looking at. There's going to be different funding models in the reserve study, so each will have a different goal in mind. This particular case, we have a funding goal of getting from the end of fiscal 2017 15% funded to the end of 2046 being 100% funded. So getting up to a 100% funded level over that 30-year period. So on this page, we just have the beginning balance, the year that we're talking about. We're discussing the cash flow of each particular year for the next 30 years. We have 2017. We have the current cost. So that's the current cost of the components. And that's inflated every year at 3%. So you'll see this increases at 3%. And within about 23 years, it'll double. And then by the end of 30 years, it's significantly higher than the current estimated cost. And that's just due to compound inflation of approximately 3%. So every about 23 years it doubles. In this case, we're going out 30 years. So it's more than doubled by the end of that 30-year period. And we want to make sure that we allocate enough to offset that increase to the current cost of the components. Next column over is the annual contribution. This is how much, in this particular funding model, how much we're recommending they place into the reserve account. Again, this is not the HOA dues or any other amount collected. This is specifically the amount that we're recommending they place in the reserve account on an annual basis. And again, this is going to increase. In this particular case, it's at 3% to offset inflation. And it's going to increase from $75,200 all the way up to $177,000. And again, that's a significant increase over that 30-year period, but it's to offset the significant increase of the current cost, which goes from $753 to $1.776 million. Next column over is the annual interest. This is just the amount of interest that is collected on the reserve account balance in that particular year. You'll notice interest really doesn't have a huge impact compared to the inflation cost of the component. In this case, we go to $286. We up to around $7,000 per year that we're estimating they'll be collecting in interest. But at that point in time, the current cost has gotten all the way to $1.7 million. So it's essentially a drop in the bucket, but it is a positive influence on the overall funding for the community. Next column over is annual expenditures. These are the projects that are expected to occur in any particular year. You'll note that some years have zero or blank. Those are just happen to be years when components do not come up expense-wise in their projections. Now, in reality, you probably will have component expenses every single year. It's unlikely that some components will just have no expenses whatsoever for a whole year. There's usually something that will come up. And these projected expenses are just that, they're projections. They're not accurate as far as exactly when components are going to fail. A roof that we're estimating to be, say a 25-year roof may last 23 years or it may last 27 years. It's going to last right around 25 would be an average that we'll utilize in our reserve study. But we don't know exactly when it's going to fail. These are just projections. But these are averages based on looking at many, many roofs in the past. And that we do that for all the components. We use averages. And so it's definitely going to play out differently than what our projections are. But it should be within a few years of when we're projecting something to fail. Unless, obviously, there's a installation issue or something like that. Then we oftentimes see failures significantly before they were projected. And that's also going to be when issues come up at communities if they are already at a low percent funded range. And say a roof that's supposed to last 25 years, it had a bad install, and it lasts 12 or 13 years and have to replace it. In that particular case, if you're already at a low funded range, you are going to be in a very bad position, and oftentimes the community organization will have to scramble for money in those particular years. It's just a higher risk for being low percent funded. Projected ending reserve balance. This is the amount that's projected to be in the reserve account at the end of each fiscal year, again for the next 30 years. And this is going to, in the recommended funding model, this is going to increase significantly over that period of time. But again, it's going to have, as you can see right here, it's going to go fluctuate up and down depending on what project expenses occur and when they occur. Next column over is the fully funded reserves. This is just the fully funded balance. So this is an ideal amount that's in the reserve account at any particular point in time. This is an amount that indicates the community is on track to paying for its cost in the future. And last column, percent funded. This is the ending reserve balance divided into the fully funded balance. Is going to give you a percent figure. So how much does a community have in the reserve account versus how much they ideally would have at any particular point in time. In this case, we're just doing it once annually and giving you a number of 15% in this case. And being this is the funding, the recommended funding model is going to grow from the current percent funded, in this case the end of fiscal 2017 of 15%, and it's going to get up to 100% by the end of the 30-year period. Again, within this time frame, it's going to fluctuate up and down depending on what projects occur and what expenses come about. And it will absolutely not follow exactly these numbers because we don't know exactly when projects are going to occur and when components are going to fail. But this is going to give you a good model to follow and has a good margin of error in there where you're able to get over humps of large expenses and eventually get up to this 100% funded range by the end of the 30-year period. Next is just the next funding model in line. In this case, it's the baseline funding model. On this page, you'll find some comments about the baseline funding model, how it's a higher risk model because it only has a goal of keeping the account above $0 for the full 30-year period. And again, the baseline funding projections, just like the recommended funding model, we have the baseline funding projections here for the next 30 years. And on the far right, again, you'll see the percent funded figures. And in this case, the baseline funding model does get up above a 50% funded level, but it also dips all the way down to, in this case, 1% funded or around $5,000 in their reserve account. And this is where you'll see the risk on this model is if some of the components were to fail earlier than projected, the community will most certainly be in a deficit in this particular year. Well, they'll have to either defer projects or do a special assessment or whatever the case is. So it's a higher risk model. Oftentimes you'll see in this baseline funding model numerous dips to around 1% or so throughout the 30-year period. In this case, it's just once. The next funding model is in this particular case, the current funding model. And in your reserve study, it probably will also follow the baseline funding model. And we go into some comments here about the current funding model. These are, again, based on the information that we were provided from the client. So the allocation rates and the current reserve account balance. These are all given to us by the client. And again, in the same format, 2017 to 2046 in this case, so over a 30-year period. And the percent funded. And again, realistically, you cannot have a negative percent funded or a negative amount in your bank account. We like to show it to show the amount in deficit the account will be in. In this case, you'll note that the reserve account balance, when it goes negative, it's highlighted in red. And over here, the interest, obviously, if there's no money in the reserve account, there's going to be no interest earned. Next, we have the reserve account expenditure chart. This is a chart, a visual chart, showing exactly when we're projecting the expenses to occur over the 30-year period in the reserve study. I like to make note of the years when there's very large expenses that are going to be coming due. I call them peak year expenses. And in a community, they may only happen every 10 or 20 years. This particular community is older, and so they have large expenses every 5 or 6 or 7 years. But a newer community may go 20 to 25 years before they have any significant expenses. And that's oftentimes when communities get in a very, very bad funded position, because they can go 15, 20 years underfunded, very low percent funded range, and have little negative consequence to it until they have these peak expense years come around and they don't have enough in their reserve account to cover the expenses, and then they have to do significant special assessments or obtain loans or defer the projects a significant amount of time. It's deceiving for a lot of communities when they do go the long period of time and they receive one of our reserve studies and they say, well, we've gone 15 years and we seem to be doing fine, and then all of a sudden they hit one of these 20, 25 year marks when they have peak year expenses, and it kind of comes to fruition the actual financial position of the association at that point in time. It's usually 20 to 25 years because we have asphalt and roofing and paint and any other number of components which tend to fail right around that 20 to 25 year mark. And as the community gets older, around the 40-year mark, we have now major siding repairs or window replacement and door replacement. It starts compounding a bit on itself. And if you don't budget for these well in advance and years in advance, you will absolutely run into positions where you are going to run out of money. And so this is just kind of a visual of that scenario. And in your particular case, in your community or your organization, you'll often see just a big spike, every 10 years or so, or every 20 years. And it's really important that when we create these budgeting models, that we get over these humps okay and continue to increase at a steady rate to get to a higher percent funded over time, so the community can get over the next hump in, say, another 10 or 20 years. Next, we have the annual expenditure report, and this is just a list of all those components which we noted earlier in that visual graph. This is just a list of all of them over the 30-year period, broken down per year and then per category, and then into the list of the components that are projected to be in need of replacement in those particular years. So in this case, we have a replacement year 2017. Within the buildings group that we have these particular components, and we also have a grounds components. We have a couple more components under grounds, and then we have a total here for 2017. That's the total amount projected to be needed and being spent on those particular components. And again, that's broken down per year, 2018 and 2019, etc. So this goes on for several pages here. You can also make note, in this case, we'll look at 2032. Say we have some very, very large expenses in 2032 for this particular community. And we can go right down here, 2032, replacement year, and we can see exactly what's going on, why there's such large expenses in this particular year. And this one it's broken across 2 pages. As you can see, replacement year 2032 continued. Most of them are on the first page. It looks like we have some of our large expenses related to the wood and stucco, paint seal, as well as the roof replacement, and another roof replacement for the garages. And that's how it adds up to these large expense years, these peak expense years. In this case, it's the roofing and the siding that needed paint. And they all kind of fell on one particular year. That's considered a peak expense year. And that's going to happen in essentially almost every community. They'll have 1 or 2, at a minimum, peak expense years over the 30-year period. Next, we have the distribution of accumulated reserves. This is just a breakdown of how the fully funded balance is calculated and how it's a culmination of the fully funded balance for each particular component. So that's essentially how much we've monetized the deterioration of each particular component based on their remaining useful life and their total cost. Eventually, down here at the end of this list, you're going to see this fully funded balance. This is just adding up all the fully funded balances of each component. You're going to come to this figure here. And here's the reserve, in this particular case, this community's reserve account balance. And that percent funded figure, this is how much they have in their reserve account versus how much they ideally would have at this particular point in time. And that equals 19%, meaning they're in kind of a low funded range where they have a high risk for running into a deficit. And this figure here, again, broken down per unit, how much the current liability per unit is. Now this can be positive as well if they had more cash than what the fully funded balance was. Typically it's a negative number though for most communities. Next is our component details section of the report. This is typically the bulk of the pages in the reserve study, and it goes into each component, and we give comments about those components. We provide pictures. There's a lot of information on these pages, everything from the place and service dates here. First, we have the name of the component, just right at the top, the category, what group it's under, place and service date, useful life, replacement year, that would be the next replacement year. In this case, it's 2017, and that's why the remaining useful life shows 0. The amount that was measured, in this case 206 linear feet, our current cost of $2.25, that's to paint these metal deck railings, about $2.25 a linear foot. Total cost, percent replacement, that's just how much we're reserving for. You may see some components that will say concrete's a common one, concrete reserve contingency, some kind of name like that, and I'll often say 10% or 15%. That just means it's a reserve to do a 10% repair to whatever item we're talking about. In this case, it could be concrete. And depending on what the component is and what the historical records are in the community and how and when things were replaced, that percent number could be different. Most components is just going to be 100% replacement, but there will be some items like concrete where you typically don't replace all the concrete, you just grind down areas or replace some slabs that have cracked and whatnot. And the future cost down below that. In this case, this component is being replaced this year, so the future cost is the same as the current cost. If we go to the next component though, you'll see these deck railings to replace. We have a current cost of $92.70 and a future cost $11,068. That's just based on inflation over the next 6 years. And again, there's comments and whatnot regarding each component. I'm going to scroll to the very end of the reserve study here to the component index section. So if you have any questions regarding any particular component, you can look it up right here. And you can see irrigation controllers. Say you got a question about that, you can go right to page 77 and it's going to talk about that. So in this PDF document, document's very easy. You can just type it in, 77, there you go, irrigation controllers, and it talks about the irrigation controllers in this particular community. You can do that with any of the components and makes navigating through the report much, much easier. And that's also why it's very beneficial to print out that component index page so that you can easily type in the numbers without having to flip back and forth to the index page. It's often easier just to print out the table of contents and the index pages and open up the PDF on your computer and follow in that way and navigate through the report that way. So that's about it. There are some other disclosures, comments and whatnot. You can read through all those. That's essentially the whole reserve study. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions or comments or any other type of information for us, please give us a call. We love to talk about this, and we love to help our clients and answer questions that come up. These reserve studies can be somewhat complicated and confusing to read if you're not familiar with them, and we understand that. So we always like to make sure we're available to answer questions whenever possible. So thank you so much.